Okay, this next book in A Fine and Pleasant Misery is called The Two-Wheeled ATV. My first all-terrain vehicle was a one-wheel drive, and it could take you anywhere you had nerve and the guts enough to pedal it. Most of the other kids around had a decent, well-mannered bicycle of distinct makes and models. Mine was a balloon-tired monster born out of wedlock, halfway between the junkyard and the second-hand store. Some local friend had built it with his own 3 hands and sold it to my mother for about the price of a good milk cow. For 2 cents, or even a used jawbreaker, I would have beaten it to death with a baseball bat, but I needed it for transportation. And transportation, then as now, was the name of the game. You could walk to some good fishing holes, all right, but the guys you were with all rode bikes. You had to walk pretty fast. Perhaps the worst thing about the bike, as I called it back within hearing range of my mother, was that you simply could not ride it in the manner that allowed you to retain any sense of dignity, let alone savoir-faire. The chief reason for this was the seat was permanently adjusted for a person about 6'4". I was a person about 5'4". The proportions of the handlebars suggested strongly they had been stolen from a bicycle belonging to a 40-year-old midget. The result of this unhappy combination was that whenever I was on the bike, my rear was always about 3 inches higher than my shoulder blades. I never tried to go any place on the bike where girls from school might see me, since it was difficult, if not impossible, in that position to maintain the image I was cultivating among them of a dashing, carefree playboy. The seat on the bike was the kind usually found on European racing bikes. The principle behind the design of the seat is that the rider goes to beat heck the sooner to get it off of it. The idea for the heel-toe walking races was conceived by someone watching the users of these particular seats footing it back home after a race. To get the proper effect of one of these seats, you might spend a couple of hours sitting balanced on the end of a baseball bat, the small end. Put a doily on it for cushioning. Whatever the guys thought of my appearance on the bike, they had respect for me. I was the fastest thing around on 2 wheels, thanks to that seat. The bike had a couple of little tricks it did with its chain at the Marquis de Sade would have envied. One was that it would wait until you had just started down a long, steep, curving hill, then reach up with its chain and wind your pant leg into the sprocket. This was undoubtedly ingenious, since the chain not only prevented you from putting on coaster brakes, it also shackled you to the hurtling death machine. Many was the time that a streamlined kid on a bike streaked silently past cars, trucks, and motorcycles on grades where a loose roller skate would break the sound barrier. The bike's other favorite trick was to throw the chain off when you needed it most. This usually happened when you were trying to outrun one of the timber wolves the neighbors kept for watchdogs. You would be standing up, pedaling for all you're worth, leaving a trail of sweat and burned rubber 2 inches wide on the road behind you. The wolf would be a black snarl coming up fast on your rear. Then the chain would jump its sprocket and drop you in with a crunch on the crossbar. The pedals still spinning furiously under your feet. The wolf gnawed on you until you got the chain back on the sprocket, or until you got tired and went home. The standard method for getting off the bike was to spring clear and let it crash. If it got the chance, It would grab you by the pant leg at the moment of ejection and drag you along to grim destruction. The bike would sometimes go for weeks without the front wheel bouncing off. This was to lure you into a false sense of security. You would be rattling, hell-bent for home past the neighbors, and for a split second, you would see the front wheel pulling away from you. Then the fork would hit the ground and whip you over the handlebars. Before you had your breath back, the wolf was standing on your belly reading the menu. I spent half my waking moments repairing the bike and the other half repairing myself. Until I was old enough to drive, I went around looking for commercial... I ran around... Sorry. Looking like a commercial for Band-Aids and Mercurochrome. I hated to stop the bike along the highway long enough to pick up an empty beer bottle for fear people would stop their cars to try to rush me to the doctor. Even on one of its good days, the bike looked like an accident in which 3 people had been killed. Much as I hated the bike, I have to admit that it was one of the truly great all-terrain vehicles. It could navigate streams, cross fallen logs, smash through brush, follow a mountain trail, and in general, do just about anything but climb trees. Several times, it did try to climb trees, but the damage to both of us was sufficient to make continued efforts in that direction seem impractical and unrewarding. Our bicycles in those days were the chief mode of transportation for 90% of our camping trips. Occasionally, even today, I see people use bicycles for camping. They'll be zipping along the road on 10-speed touring bikes, their ultralight camping gear, a neat little package on the rear fender. When we went camping, on our one-speed bikes, it looked as if we had a baby elephant on the handlebars and the mother on behind. Loading a bicycle for a camping trip was not simply a remarkable feat of engineering, it was a blatant defiance of all the laws of physics. First of all, there may have been ultralight camping gear in those days, but we didn't own any of it. Our skillet alone weighed more than one of today's touring bikes, and a bedroll in cold weather, even without a feather bed, was the weight of the size of a bale of straw. The tent was a tarp that worked winters as a haystack cover. A good portion of our food was carried in the quart jars our mothers had canned in it. Then there were all the axes, hatchets, saws, machetes, and World War II surplus bayonets, without which no camping trip was complete. And of course, I could never leave behind my jungle hammock, the pride of my life, just in case I happened to come across a jungle. The standard packing procedure was to dump most of your stuff into the center of the tarp, roll the tarp up into a bundle, tie it together with half a mile of rope, then find 9 boys and a man to lift it up to the back fender of the bike. Anything left over was rolled up in a jungle hammock and tied to the diminutive handlebars. The hardware was distributed evenly around the outside of the 2 massive bundles, just in case you had sudden need for an axe or a bayonet. If you sprang into the saddle and pedaled with all the fury you could generate from 98 pounds of bone and muscle, the bike would howl in rage. The twin humps of camp gear would shudder and sway like a sick camel, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the whole catastrophe would move out of the yard and wobble down the road on some incredible journey. Sometimes during the winter now, when the cold awakens in my bones and flesh, the ache of thousand-old injuries, I suddenly will recall a vivid detail, the last few terrifying moments of the bike's existence as a recognizable entity. A ragged gypsy band of us had begun another trip into the mountains on our camel-humped ATVs. As usual, I was far out of the lead, the hatchet head bicycle seat urging me on. There was a hill about 3 miles from my home called Sand Creek Hill, a name deceptive in its lack of color and description. By rights, the hill should have been called Dead Man's Drop or Say Goodbye Hill. Loggers drove their trucks down it with one foot on the running board and one hand clutching the rosary, even the atheists. Just as I crested the hill and started my descent, whom should I have noticed coming up but one of our neighbor's wolves, apparently returning home from after a hard night of killing elk in the mountains. From 50 yards away, I could see his face brighten as he caught sight of me hurtling toward him like doom on 2 wheels. He crouched expectantly, his eyes happily agleam. The chain, not to be outdone, chose that moment to eat my pant leg halfway up to the knee. I expected to be abandoned by the front wheel any second. The washboard road rattled my bones, axes, saws, and bayonets filled the air on all sides. And great straining mass of the rear pack threatened to collapse on me. With one last great effort, I aimed a quick kick at the wolf, ripped the pant leg free, and threw myself into space. I bounced 4 times to distribute the injuries evenly about my body, and finally, using my nose for a brake, slid to a stop. The bike apparently self-destructed shortly after my departure. Probably the front wheel came off, and the 2 packs on it took it from there, ripping and tearing, mashing and grinding, until there was nothing left but a streak of assorted rubble stretching off down the hill. Even the wolf was somewhat shaken by the impact of the crash. He stared at the wreckage in silent awe, almost forgetting my one good leg he held in his slack jaws. When I was up and around once more, my mother brought me a car, my second ATV. She got it from a local friend who had built it on his own 3 hands. But that's another story.